Command had already signed their death sentence. The SEALs had no way across, trapped at the river's edge. But one woman climbed into her jet without permission, and in a single pass, she changed everything. You're watching the Scape, where impossible orders collide with unforgettable courage. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from right now? The river was wide, dark, and merciless. It carved through the valley like a scar no bridge could mend, churning with a current so violent it swallowed whole trees without slowing. On its far bank, the SEALs were pinned down, bodies pressed into the mud, helmets smeared with grit and blood. They had tried to slip across under the cover of night, hoping to move unseen, but by dawn, the truth was staring them down. The crossing had been blown apart. The only bridge had been reduced to twisted metal, its beams sunk beneath the current. No boats, no cover, no retreat. Only the river, deep, fast, and watched from every angle. Every time a man so much as raised his head above the reeds, gunfire erupted from the cliffs across the water. Machine gun nests had been dug into the high ridges, overlapping arcs of fire that reached every inch of the shoreline. One SEAL tried to lift the antenna higher for a better signal, and a burst of fire chewed through the dirt around his hand until he dropped flat, cursing under his breath. They weren't moving forward and they weren't moving back. The river had become a wall, and the enemy was content to let them rot behind it. Inside the command tent miles away, the verdict had already been spoken. The logbook listed the river sector as a red zone, uncrossable. Maps glowed on screens, dotted with overlapping circles of anti-air coverage. The officers stood over them in silence, heads bowed, hands folded tight behind their backs. One general jabbed a finger at the valley. Even a treetop run won't make it through. No jet can survive that gauntlet. Another shook his head, voice flat. It's not a crossing anymore. It's a coffin. The words carried more weight than they realized. In the valley, the SEALs knew it too. Radio sputtered with clipped transmissions, men too tired to waste energy on false hope. We're still here. No way across. The words weren't just updates. They were eulogies, spoken in real time. The sun climbed higher, burning the mist away, leaving the men exposed to the unblinking eye of the enemy across the water. Shadows shrank. Ammunition ran low. Water canteens were nearly dry. Time wasn't measured in hours anymore, only in minutes, maybe seconds. The men counted each one in silence, eyes scanning the riverbank out of habit, not expectation. Air support had saved them before, in other battles, other valleys. But here, in this place, air support wasn't coming. The maps said so. The brass said so. And in their hearts, they had started to believe it. Still, one of the younger SEALs broke the silence, voice thin, cracking under the strain. "What if someone ignores them?" he whispered. No one answered. He wasn't asking because he believed it. He was asking because he needed to hear the idea said out loud, even if only once, before the end. Back at the airfield, dust swirled across the tarmac. The other pilots were still grounded, waiting for clearance that would never come. But one hangar door stood open. Inside, a woman climbed into the cockpit of her A-10, strapping in with steady hands. She hadn't asked permission. She hadn't waited for orders. She didn't care about the word uncrossable. To her, it was nothing more than a challenge. Her visor slid down, reflecting the runway ahead. Her fingers danced across switches, engines coughing once, then growling to life. The ground trembled beneath the weight of the beast waking from its slumber. Outside the control tower, crew chiefs turned their heads in disbelief. She hadn't filed a flight plan. She hadn't even spoken into the comms. By the time someone shouted, "Who authorized that launch?" her wheels were already leaving the ground, dust spraying in her wake. The SEALs didn't know it yet. To them, the sky was just another layer of silence pressing down on their ribs. They thought they had been abandoned. They thought command had already signed their death sentence. But then, faint at first, weaving through the canyon walls, came a sound they had stopped believing in. It wasn't the high-pitched scream of a fighter jet. It was heavier, deeper, a metallic growl, the unmistakable thunder of twin engines not built for speed, but for survival. A sound that once heard could never be mistaken. Heads turned, eyes widened, hearts that had given up minutes ago now hammered against ribs. One SEAL's lips parted, dry and cracked. He whispered it like a prayer, afraid to speaking too loud would shatter the fragile hope sparking between them. She's coming. And for the first time that day, the river wasn't just death. It was a challenge, waiting to be answered. The growl in the distance deepened until it rattled the very stones under the SEALs' boots. Men who had stopped believing in miracles lifted their eyes toward the eastern horizon. For a heartbeat, there was nothing, just the jagged ridges, the sky burning pale under the midday sun, and then the shadow appeared. It came low, too low, skimming the tops of the cliffs with wings that seemed almost to scrape the stone. Dust plumed in its wake, tracer fire already reaching for it like claws. The A-10 Warthog crested the ridge, shark mouth painted wide across its nose, engines howling as if daring the valley itself to strike. The SEAL nearest the river dropped his jaw in disbelief. "No way," he muttered, his voice cracking. Another clenched his fist so tight his knuckles turned white. "She's insane. They'll cut her down before she gets close." But in his eyes was something he hadn't felt in hours. Recognition. That sound, that silhouette. It wasn't just another pilot. It was her. Inside the command tent, panic erupted. Screens lit with alerts, radar tracking the single blip plunging into the red zone. A colonel's face flushed crimson as he shouted, "Who cleared that launch? Who the hell gave her permission?" Technicians scrambled, fumbling for answers, but no one had one. She hadn't waited for clearance. She hadn't asked. "Order her to turn back," another voice barked. "She's flying straight into the kill box. It's suicide." But even as the words were shouted, the monitors told a different story. The jet was already threading the canyon, altitude dropping in a controlled dive that no flight manual would have dared to suggest. To the brass, it was reckless. To the SEALs, pinned under the cliffs, it was salvation in motion. The first wave of fire rose to meet her. Tracer rounds arced across the sky, red and green claws converging. Anti-air batteries hidden in the rock spat missiles that streaked white against the blue. The gorge lit up with a storm meant to tear steel apart. Commanders leaned over screens, voices cracking. "She'll never clear it. She'll be gone in 30 seconds. But in the cockpit, her voice was calm, almost steady. Raven 1, on approach. She wasn't talking to the command tent. She wasn't waiting for their reply. She was speaking for the SEALs and for herself. The SEALs pressed tighter against the riverbank as the first missile streaked past, detonating in the sky. Shards of metal rained into the water, sending up plumes that slapped against their helmets. The jet twisted through the chaos with movements that looked less like flying and more like defiance. Banking so low her wingtip almost kissed the river. Rolling hard enough, the dust exploded from the canyon wall. Each second stretched into an eternity as she fought physics itself to stay alive.
One SEAL, Ramirez, spat blood into the dirt and laughed bitterly. Every pilot flinches, every damn one of them. That's how they end up in pieces. His voice cut through the chaos. raw but steady. Another turned to him, eyes locked on the black silhouette diving through tracer fire. Ramirez shook his head. Not her. Not this one. Back in the tent, disbelief turned to a grim kind of silence. Even the generals who had barked for her to turn back leaned forward now, knuckles white on the edge of the table, eyes fixed on the single blip cutting across their screens. "She can't make it," one muttered, but his voice had lost conviction. He was saying it like a man trying to convince himself. And then the valley itself shook. The GAU-8 cannon spun up, its metallic roar drowning out the storm. 30-millimeter shells poured into the cliffsides, ripping through bunkers, detonating emplacements that had sat untouched for weeks. The gorge lit in fire and thunder. SEALs clutched their helmets as dust and flame cascaded over them. Above the smoke, the A-10 tore a line across the sky, engines blazing. For the first time all day, the impossible was no longer theory. It was reality, screaming over the river, with a shark mouth painted in defiance. One of the younger SEALs whispered what every man felt but hadn't dared say. "She's not here to try." He swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the jet. "She's here to win." The gorge had become a cage of fire. Tracer rounds stitched the sky in every direction, so thick it looked as if the air itself had turned hostile. Missiles clawed upward from hidden emplacements carved into the cliffs. The river foamed beneath the thunder, each detonation throwing up curtains of water that caught the sunlight in savage flashes. The SEALs flattened themselves against the ground, helmets rattling with each impact. The valley shook with such violence that one of them muttered, "The whole damn river's gonna collapse on us." Yet not one man dared to look away. Their eyes were locked on the silhouette, weaving through the chaos. The A-10 rolled hard, wingtip almost slicing the spray from the river. She dropped flares that ignited in blossoms of white heat, luring missiles wide into the cliffs. A second later, she banked right, nose down, riding the gorge like a road only she could see. It wasn't flying. It was defiance carved into motion. Back in the operations tent, the air reeked of sweat and panic. Officers shouted over one another, voices cutting sharp across the static of the comms. "Get her out of there. She'll be torn apart. She's already crossed the first defense ring. Look." "Crossed? That sector is a kill zone. She won't last another 30 seconds.
On the main screen, her call sign blinked stubbornly. Raven 1. Each time it passed another defense perimeter, red alarms flared on the display. A younger officer leaned forward, whispering under his breath, "He's threading it. No one has ever threaded it." He didn't realize others had gone silent to listen. One general slammed his fist against the table. "This is insubordination. She's not saving them. She's gambling all of us on her arrogance." But his words trembled. They no longer carried certainty. The men who had once spoken with iron conviction now sounded like they were trying to convince themselves. Out in the gorge, the Warthog shuddered as flak tore the air around it. Shrapnel clawed across the fuselage, sparking off steel. In the cockpit, alarms screamed, lights flashing red across the console. Her breathing stayed calm, controlled. Hands steady on the stick, eyes locked on the narrowing valley ahead. She had been here before. Not this gorge, not this river, but in other places commanders had labeled impossible. She remembered the weight of silence after missions no one admitted happened, the empty commendations that never touched her record. Survival had never been about glory. It was about refusing to let impossible be the last word. "Not today," she muttered under her breath, voice steady beneath the roar. On the ground, the SEALs clung to every maneuver, every impossible roll. Ramirez spat into the dirt, muttering bitterly. "Every pilot flinches. Every damn one of them. That's when they die." His words cut the air like a curse, but even as he said them, his eyes told another story. They followed the black shape carving through tracer fire without a stutter, without hesitation. His jaw clenched. He admitted, the words tasting like disbelief. "She's not flinching." The jet roared overhead, close enough that the SEALs felt the air compress their lungs, close enough that the river itself rippled from the pressure. Dust cascaded from the cliffs, mingling with smoke until the valley seemed to choke on its own violence. And then the cannon spoke again. The GAU-8's growls split the gorge, a sound deeper and more primal than anything else on the battlefield. The cliffs themselves seemed to recoil as its rounds chewed through bunkers, detonating stockpiles and blossoms of fire. The machine gun nests that had silenced the riverbank for hours vanished under the storm of steel. The SEALs raised their heads, stunned. Positions that had locked them down all morning were being shredded before their eyes. For the first time, the impossible no longer seemed absolute. Back in the command tent, silence spread wider than the alarms. Men who had shouted for her to retreat now stared, lips tight, unable to form the words. The younger officer swallowed hard. His voice shook, but there was steel in it now. She's not gambling. She's rewriting the map.
The general turned on him, eyes cold, but his protest died in his throat because outside, in the valley, the truth was undeniable. The SEALs who had been trapped like animals at the river's edge were rising to their knees now, dust and sweat streaking their faces. One of them, barely audible, almost reverent, let the words slip. "She's making a way." And with each pass, the river that had been their prison began to look less like death and more like survival waiting to be claimed. The gorge had become a storm of fire, not just tracer rounds now, but missiles streaking from every angle, smoke trails cutting jagged scars through the air. The enemy had thrown open every weapon they had, desperate to drag her down. From the cliffs, the guns roared without pause, the sound reverberating so violently it felt like the mountains themselves were trying to shake her from the sky. The SEALs pressed low, helmets rattling as fragments rained down from detonations above. Dust and shards of rock cascaded around them, stinging their faces, filling their lungs. One of them shouted over the roar, "There's no way she survives this!" But even as he said it, his voice cracked, because through the chaos, the sound of her engines hadn't faltered once. That guttural growl, that relentless thunder, it cut through everything, steady, unyielding. Inside the command tent, the tension boiled over. Generals barked orders that no one obeyed. Technicians stared at their screens as if glued, watching the single blinking call sign thread deeper into the kill zone. "Order her out," one demanded. "She won't hear you," another replied, sweat dripping down his temple. "She's already inside the grid. There's no pulling back now." The older general slammed his fist into the table. "She's reckless. She's going to kill herself, and she'll take what's left of our hope with her." But the youngest officer, the one who had been whispering all along, leaned forward, eyes locked on the screen. His voice was quiet, but sharp enough to cut through the shouting. "Or she'll save them all." In the cockpit, alarms screamed. Red lights blazed across her console, warnings stacking one over the other. Missile lock, hydraulic strain, engine stress. Any one of them was reason to break off. Together, they were a death sentence. But her hands never trembled. Instead, she reached forward, flipped a switch, and killed her targeting computer. Manual mode. Back in the tent, someone saw the telemetry spike. "She disabled computer assist," a colonel gasped. "That's suicide." But the older general's eyes went wide. He knew better. His voice was low, almost reverent. "That's her way. She trusts her hands more than any machine." The A-10 banked hard, hugging the cliff so close that sparks jumped as stone kissed steel. Missiles streaked past her, fooled by flares, detonating against the rock face in blossoms of fire. Each move looked impossible, yet the jet seemed almost alive in her grip, an extension of her will, her refusal. On the ground, the SEALs lifted their heads now. disbelief etched across their dirt-streaked faces. They had seen pilots before, good ones, reckless ones, doomed ones, but never this. Never someone who treated the word impossible as if it were nothing more than a suggestion. Ramirez exhaled hard, dust streaking his cheeks. "She's not flying through it," he muttered. His brothers glanced at him, confused. He shook his head, eyes locked on the black shape cutting through tracer fire. "She's bending it to her will." The gorge trembled again as the GAA U-8 cannon spun up. Its thunder drowned every other sound, a roar so deep it shook the river itself. The rounds tore across the far bank, ripping through machine gun nests, detonating charges wired into the cliffs. Explosions cascaded in a chain reaction, smoke boiling upward in furious plumes. The SEALs shielded their faces from the shock waves, ears ringing, hearts hammering. When they dared to look again, positions that had trapped them all morning were gone, obliterated in a single pass. In the command tent, silence fell heavier than any explosion. Men who had mocked her, condemned her, sat frozen, watching the impossible unfold. The younger officer's lips tightened as he whispered, "She's not reckless, she's inevitable." The river, once a sentence of death, was changing before their eyes. The path was opening, not by command, not by orders, but by the will of one woman who refused to let the word impossible dictate their fate. For the SEALs, pinned on the bank with no hope left, the realization cut deep. They weren't just watching a pilot. They were watching a legend being carved out of fire and steel. The valley was no longer just a battlefield. It was a crucible. Smoke coiled into the sky in heavy black columns. Tracer fire carved vicious streaks through the air, and the river below surged like a beast awakened by blood. The SEALs had been pinned there for hours, pressed so flat against the bank that the mud seemed to claim them as its own. But now heads lifted, eyes widened. Something was changing. Where once machine gun nests had ruled every approach, there were only smoking craters. The bunkers that had turned the gorge into a death trap lay broken, their barrels twisted and glowing. Stone itself had been ripped open by the GAA U-8, leaving jagged scars where emplacements once stood. The impossible wasn't gone, not yet, but the edges of it were crumbling. Ramirez, his face streaked with grime and dried blood, pressed himself back against the stone and let out a laugh that startled even him. It wasn't humor. It was disbelief, awe. "She's clearing it," he muttered, shaking his head. "She's actually clearing it." But the river was not yet theirs. Laced through the skeletal ruins of the destroyed bridge were the enemy's final cards. Charges, hidden deep in beams and crisscrossed wires. If they detonated, the entire gorge would become a funeral pyre, drowning soldiers and jet alike in fire and collapse. Every man on that riverbank knew it. The generals in the command tent knew it. And above them all, the woman in the cockpit knew it too. Inside the tent, panic spiked again. Red warnings blinked across every screen as the thermal feed lit up with the heat signatures of the charges. "She's not seriously going for those," a colonel shouted, his voice nearly cracking. "Manual targeting against interference? That's suicide." The younger officer, the one who had been silent through the shouting, leaned forward, eyes locked on her call sign. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the noise. "No," he said, "that's her way." In the cockpit, alarms screamed, each one a death sentence. Missile lock, engine strain, structural stress. Any pilot would have broken off. She didn't. Her thumb flipped the final switch, and the targeting computer died. Manual control. Her breathing steadied as if the chaos outside didn't matter. It was just her, the river,
and the impossible task laid out before her. She rolled the jet low, descending so close to the water that spray leapt into her wake. Tracer fire clawed around her, missiles streaked overhead, but her hands stayed precise, her grip unshaking. The gorge narrowed into a funnel, stone walls closing in, yet the A-10 moved as if it belonged there, as if this gauntlet of death had been carved for her alone. Then the GAU-8 spoke. The cannon's growl tore through the gorge, deafening, relentless. Rounds stitched across the fractured bridge, tearing into girders and cutting through wires. The first charge erupted, flame cascading into the next, and then another. One by one, the explosives chained together, each blast shaking the valley like the beat of a war drum. The seals flattened themselves as shock waves ripped across the bank. Dust and rock rained down. The river itself bucked, waves slamming against the shore as if recoiling from the violence. For seconds that felt eternal, the world was nothing but fire and thunder. And then, silence. When the haze thinned, the impossible revealed itself. The bridge was gone. Not collapsed outward into a tomb, not detonated into chaos, but folded in on itself, shredded with such precision that the path beyond the river lay open. The kill zone had been erased. The seals stared in stunned disbelief. Their prison was gone. The wall of death that had chained them to the riverbank had vanished. For the first time in endless hours, the way forward was clear. One seal, barely above a whisper, breathed the words, "She made the crossing possible." Another clenched his weapon, voice harder. "She made it ours."
Back in the command tent, the air was heavy with silence. Generals who had screamed for her retreat, who condemned her for insubordination, now stood wordless. The younger officer finally straightened, his jaw set. "She didn't just survive the grid," he said quietly. "She destroyed it." The older general pressed his hands against the table, his face pale, eyes fixed on the blinking call sign that refused to die. "She erased impossible," he muttered. Out in the gorge, Raven 1 climbed again, her jet battered and scarred, smoke trailing from its engines, but alive, impossibly alive. Warning lights still flared across her console, hydraulics groaned, yet her hand stayed steady. She wasn't flying to save herself. She was flying to make sure the seals could move. On the bank, the men rose from the dirt, shakily at first, then with purpose. For hours they had been prisoners. Now they were soldiers again, checking weapons, counting ammunition, preparing to cross the river that had nearly buried them. The river was no longer their grave. It was their escape, and every man knew whose defiance had carved that path. The smoke peeled away in ragged veils, torn by wind and gunfire, and for the first time all day, the far bank looked less like a death sentence and more like possibility. The nests, the bunkers, the wall of fire, they were gone, nothing but twisted husks buried in smoke. For hours, the seals had stared at that river like men already buried alive. Now, the impossible stood broken. The crossing was open. "Move!" Ramirez barked. No hesitation, no argument. It was a voice that carried years of muscle memory, and the squad responded as if a switch had flipped. Gear checks snapped into rhythm. Magazines slapped home, slings tightened, belts cinched. A rope gun cracked, its line whipping across the torrent. The hook bit into the shattered spine of steel on the far bank. The first pair slipped into the current, low and silent, water sheeting off their helmets. Behind them they stacked tight, rifles angled down, breath measured. Above, Raven 1 circled back into the gorge,
her A-10 trailing smoke but still alive, the beast's engines grinding against the air like iron teeth. Windows open, her voice came steady over the net. Cross now, don't stop. Inside the command tent, the silence was colder than before. Generals who had spent hours condemning the river as suicide now stared at screens that showed their men crossing, one pair at a time. A junior controller licked his lips. Raven 1, fuel state. Static hissed before her reply came, low and matter-of-fact. Enough to finish. On the riverbank, water surged, biting at the first two swimmers. One man vanished, pulled under by a whirlpool, but a tug on the line snapped him back to the surface, sputtering curses drowned by the roar above. The current tried to rip them sideways, but the rope held, bowed into a trembling arc. Step by step, crawl by crawl, they made it to the far bank, where waiting rifles snapped outward into a wedge. Hand signals cut through the mist. Cover, clear, send two more. But the gorge wasn't finished. A crack rang out sharp and precise. A sniper, hidden high in a notch of rock untouched by the cannon. The round smacked into stone inches from a swimmer's head. Ramirez swore, but before he could shout, the A-10 rolled into a dive. She didn't ask, she didn't wait. The GAU-8 answered for her, stitching fire into the notch until stone turned to dust and the rifle fell silent. "Keep moving," she ordered. Her voice had that steel calm that made chaos irrelevant. The SEALs obeyed. Two by two they moved. The rope trembled, arms strained, gear dragged heavy with water, but every pair that reached the far side dropped instantly into formation, securing ground no one thought possible hours before. On the third rotation, the gorge spat back. A launcher hidden in the northern ridge flared, belching a missile into the blue. Command saw it on the thermal first, but she didn't need the warning. The A-10 spun into the climb, dumped flares like sparks from a forge, and bent the plane into a turn no engineer would have blessed. The missile bit on heat, veered wide, and slammed into the cliff with a bloom that shook stone down into the river like rain. Her console blared red. Hydraulic pressure sagged. A panel tore loose, cartwheeling into smoke. The jet groaned but held together. "Still flying," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "Still here." On the bank, Ramirez spotted the trap before it sprung. A culvert cracked open, spitting a buried belt fed that ripped across the crossing. Water exploded in lines, bullets slicing the current. One man gasped at the wrong second and vanished under red water. Ramirez dove without thought, the current dragging him toward the culvert's maw. He locked his grip on the man's vest and braced himself for teeth. They never came. The culvert vanished in sparks and fire as the Warthog's nose dipped again, cannon rounds pounding the trap into silence. The river spat both men back up. SEALs on the far bank lunged, dragging them onto dirt before the current claimed them. Ramirez coughed, spat river water, then raised a fist. "Next pair," he rasped. By the time the last four reached the rope, the line itself was groaning, thread straining. Midway across, it sagged dangerously. "Line's failing," someone gasped. "Then move," Raven 1 ordered. They moved. Shoulders screamed, gear dragged like anchors, but the last pair lunged through the current, carried by sheer fury. Hands reached, hauling them in. Boots hit mud. The final man rolled onto the far bank, gasping and laughing at once, the sound more oxygen than joy. "All across," Ramirez said, voice rough but steady. He looked up, eyes narrowing at the dark silhouette overhead. "Thanks for the road." "Not a road, a minute. That's all I bought you." The SEALs regrouped, rifles out, eyes scanning the ridges that had mocked them all morning. But the ridges were silent now, smoke drifting like surrender. In the command tent, the general stood pale and wordless. One finally closed the map that had condemned the river as impassable. The younger officer, who believed when no one else would, whispered, "She didn't cross it. She erased it. Above, Raven 1 circled one last time. The jet was battered, one wing leaking fluid, panels torn, alarms screaming in her ears. She didn't care. She turned into the light, climbing out of the gorge she had defied, her engines leaving trails across the smoke-stained sky. Down below, the SEALs signaled the incoming helos, their path safe now, only because one woman had refused the word, impossible. As the rotors chopped the air and boots pounded the far bank, they looked up once more. They didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They simply watched, silent and certain, because some things don't need words. The younger officer in the tent turned to the older general. He asked, "What will you call this?" The general's voice was low, stripped of rank and pride. He said, "We'll call it what it was, survival, bought in one pass." And the river that had been their grave was now their salvation, cleared by a single pilot whose engines still echoed like thunder in their bones.